On January the 12th, around 50,000 people in a crowd that stretched to 3 kilometers in length took it to the streets of Bucharest to protest the cancelled presidential elections in a political rally that, while peaceful, was still big enough to make it into the top 5 biggest in recent memory. You can also tell it bothered the right people by both the slant in the headlines, the wild estimations of the size, and the insistence of most to discuss crowd size rather than the issue at hand. Why exactly did this rally have to be held in the first place? Why were the presidential elections in Romania cancelled? Was there a real danger? Who is Călin Georgescu, and why exactly is Brussels so happy about this clown show? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so we're in the middle of a clown show here in Romania, one that I must admit I'm enjoying more than my fellow political operatives. In fact, most of my fellow political operatives are terrified or at the very least mildly concerned. I, however, am not. And that's because this clown show is slowly achieving what I've been advocating for since 2017, which is the utter demolition of the current establishment. And while 8 years ago this was a tiny minority position, now it's a position held by a comfortable majority portion of the public. The pandemic project and the utter stupidity of the social liberals has helped a lot in growing this position. We can also thank the European Union for finally making Euroscepticism a mainstream position in Romania as well. That has to be the biggest achievement of the European Union here this decade anyway. So, speaking of 2017, in February that year I made a video called Introduction to Romanian Politics, which I urge you to watch so I don't have to repeat too many details again. Since that video, 3 new parliamentary parties have appeared, one in 2020 as a reaction to the pandemic project and the culmination of various dissident projects, and that would be the Alliance for the Unification of Romanians, which is also the political party that organized the rally on January the 12th, but also some of the other protests and judicial activism during the pandemic project. Also, besides this one, there are 2 more so-called far-right parties that are partially splintered from the alliance and partially a reaction to the alliance becoming increasingly mature and mainstream, namely the SOS Party and the Youth Party, or the Young People's Party, which, in a twist of irony, is also the political party with proportionally the most old people in its membership. These last 2 emerged during the 2024 election cycle, although they've been brewing since 2022 as a result of the end of the pandemic project and the perfectly predictable collapse of the ad hoc coalition from that time, and of course as a result of the new political and economical challenges brought by the Russian escalation in neighboring Ukraine. None of this is surprising to anyone who understands the context. In fact, here at the sofa, at least on the Romanian language channel, we predicted all of this years ahead of it happening, and for the most part, we've been proven right, although with a very few exceptions. But then again, only those who don't work make no mistakes, as a Romanian proverb says. And it all went according to how the logic dictated, until the final days of the campaign for the first round of scheduled presidential elections in November 2024, when suddenly this guy, Călin Georgescu, saw a rise in popularity. He'd been polling at around 6% for most of the year, far behind the favorites. The election campaign was logically flowing, maybe I should say, in the direction of a final between the incumbent Prime Minister, Social Democrat Marcel Ciolacu, and the younger Vice President of the European Conservatives group, George Simion, with the Alliance for the Unification of Romanians. But As another Romanian proverb says, sometimes the plan made at home doesn't fit the one unfolding in the market. The first round delivered the final between small-town mayor and former tabloid reporter Elena Lasconi with the Westoid progressive USR and the nominally independent Călin Georgescu. This took the political stage by storm and shook the political stage, maybe I should say, in ways that it hadn't been since 2000 when National Communist Vadim Tudor ended up in the final against the international communist Ioan Iliescu. Except this time it was worse. Or at least the perception was, and sometimes still is, that this time is worse. Just like in 2000 with Vadim, Călin Georgescu was invisible in the traditional media and even in most of social media, while Mrs. Lasconi just narrowly finished above the incumbent prime minister, in part because enough people were willing to forgive her inadequacy in exchange for sticking it up to the ruling party, but also because the Social Democrats were involved in their own conspiracy of trying to engineer a final between their candidate, Marcel Ciolacu, and a so-called far-right candidate. And this is where things get complicated. Following the first round, we titled on the sofa that this was a result of all of the conspiracies happening at the same time. At first, people thought we were engaging in an exercise of developing a catchy phrase, but as the weeks and months went on, the evidence now completely supports exactly that thesis. So, the Social Democrats initially preferred the final against the ECR guy, George Simion. But they had noticed in the last week of the campaign the same thing we noticed as well, which is the sudden surge of Mr. Georgescu. They didn't know why this was happening, but they were just as okay with the final between Mr. Ciolacu and Mr. Georgescu as they had been with the Ciolacu-Simion final. So they asked some of their most trustworthy voters to pull the lever in the first round for Mr. Georgescu, since he was now poised to be the more likely finalist than Mr. Simion. The trouble is that this conspiracy went too well, and Mr. Ciolacu lost enough votes just to narrowly be pulled beneath the Westoid liberal small-town mayor, Mrs. Lasconi. So, just like that, the final was now to be held between two candidates that nominally did not represent either of the two main political parties, the Social Democrats and the National Liberals. Still, the questions remained, particularly this one. How come Mr. Georgescu surged from 6% to 22% so fast? The first to blame, in the subsequent blame game, was the social media platform where Mr. Georgescu had been most active, the CCP-owned TikTok. Except even that was a bit of a problem. Mr. Georgescu had not been the most visible candidate there either. He wasn't even in the top 3. The most visible political figure on TikTok was George Simion, followed by the incumbent prime minister, then the small-town mayor Mrs. Lasconi, and the distant fourth, the nominally independent Mr. Georgescu. So it wasn't, and still isn't, exactly credible that TikTok is at fault for the finalists to end up being the third and the fourth most visible candidates on the platform, but not the first two. This simply isn't credible except for various leftists in the European Parliament who repeat this claim even today. Here's from January the 21st in the European Parliament.
Yes, I mean, in Romanian, there was a problem that with the elections, that your secret, the Romanian Secret Service highlighted, and that was that TikTok had labeled all competitors for the election as political content, and therefore was suppressing that content, was keeping people from seeing that content in great numbers. While there was one candidate, the far-right content, that TikTok had decided not to label as political content, and therefore it could flood everybody's timelines. So you know that TikTok is a Chinese company. Do you think it's correct that a Chinese company that reports to the Chinese government decides which kind of political content the citizens of Romania can see?
Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't anything illegal necessarily, but it simply isn't true that Mr. Georgescu was the TikTok candidate. But explaining that takes a long time. I just made a 90-minute long video in Romanian about Mr. Georgescu's history. Contrary to contemporary media claims, Mr. Georgescu wasn't some unknown figure, and contrary to his fans' claims, he isn't some agent of change either. He's been part of the regime and a top-tier grafter for 34 years, and the only reason current NPCs don't like him is because he's been too good with his grift. Unlike the media NPCs who've been involved in the so-called defending democracy grift, overwhelmingly funded by Soros Gheorghiu in the 1990s and beyond, Mr. Georgescu was part of the environmentalist grift. Sustainable development, Klaus Schwab style of globalism, that was his shtick. Until 3 years ago, when he correctly figured it out that grift was coming to an end and pivoted to a 1980s version of national communism combined with some new age rhetoric. The guy is basically a professional imposter and a grifter, one who has truly mastered this art. Sure, he's not as good as Klaus Schwab, but close enough, actually. Anyway, long story short, the regime in Romania was really not satisfied with this at all, and the incumbent president, Klaus Iohannis, calls for a meeting of the National Security Council on November the 28th, 2024. This council, legally called the Supreme Council for the Defense of the Country, is a structure that involves all of the three-letter agencies, including military intelligence, the Prime Minister, and the President. It's the most real-world incarnation of the regime, basically. And during that meeting, the three-letter agencies presented their reports on the election. By statute, these meetings are classified, but their content can be partially or fully declassified by the president for any reason or no reason. And this is exactly what President Iohannis did a few days later on December the 4th, 2024, just 4 days before the scheduled second round of the presidential election. In the meantime, between the first round and this declassification, two other events occurred. The general election, in which two so-called far-right new parties made it into the new parliament, was held, and the Constitutional Court decided that the first round of the presidential election was entirely kosher and the second round can proceed as planned. Well, this declassification changed things. It shouldn't have, but it did. And this is where the controversy really is to this day. You see, the Constitutional Court is not allowed to act on its own initiative. The Constitutional Court is always supposed to answer when it's petitioned by either citizens via the normal courts or by the special authorities explicitly written in the Constitution to be having the power to summon the court. Well, the Constitutional Court on December the 6th did exactly that. It acted on its own initiative and reversed its decision from a few days prior and suddenly annulled the entire presidential election process, citing the declassified documents as evidence for irregularities. This move will likely, very likely really, result in a reform of the Constitutional Court by the end of this decade, and 2/3 of the voters think this was a very bad idea. But the regime people still thought it was worth the risk because the danger of Mr. Georgescu winning the presidency was too high. Except there's another problem, from which several more other problems derived in the last month as well. The declassified documents are, to put it mildly, absolute bonkers. The quality of the reports is significantly lower than a 6th grade composition in creative writing, and they offer no concrete evidence. Certainly no evidence that would be admissible in a proper court. Hours after declassification, here on the sofa, we gathered to evaluate them and came up with our own report, which basically said that the famous documents are one big nothing burger. After publishing, several hours later, former President Băsescu came out and said the exact same thing. At the time, saying this was instantly labeled as Russian propaganda, but in the almost 2 months that passed since then, this position is now the mainstream view, mostly because, just as we predicted, there was no evidence of Russian meddling. And do keep in mind that here at the sofa, at the very least, we did take the allegation very seriously, given that we've been discussing this issue long before the mainstream even knew that this is a topic. However, just because we're concerned about the very real issue of Russian disinformation That absolutely does not mean we have to believe or assume good faith on the part of regime apparatchiks. It was the Russians, trust me bro, is not enough. To make things worse for the regime, their strongest argument, namely that one particular pro-Georgescu campaign was nearly identical to a Kremlin media campaign deployed in Ukraine in 2021 prior to the invasion, well, that pro-Georgescu campaign really did resemble the Kremlin's work, but it turned out it had been funded by a state actor, just like the three-letter agencies claimed, except that state actor was Romanian. Specifically, the junior partner in government, the National Liberal Party. As I was saying, all of the conspiracies at once. And from that point on, we're now into clown show territory because the entire situation is now untenable. The regime annulled the election effectively because they didn't like the prospective winner. And there's no way around this fact, no matter how much party shills are trying to deflect from this. To make matters worse, the Constitutional Court, in its decision to annul the election and order a repeat of the whole process, also went with a dubious interpretation of the Constitution and said the incumbent, Klaus Iohannis, can remain president until a new president is elected. This ended up pissing off the Westoid left as well and split the politics now into pro-regime people and everyone else. Usually, in these cases, the Westoid left would side with the regime, but not this time. Much to the desperation of the National Liberals, who are now slowly realizing that they are indeed being flattened, just as we predicted since 2020, but that's a story for another day. What's important to remember now is that all of the official justification for this is a lie. There is no evidence of the Russians having had anything to do with Mr. Georgescu's surge in the polls, and plenty of evidence that this situation is mostly self-inflicted by the conspiracies of both the Social Democrats and the National Liberals, and all of those conspiracies going wrongly and then hastily trying to fix the situation once they've realized that they were in fact digging their own political graves. Now, I was saying earlier that this will very likely result in a reform of the Constitutional Court by the end of this decade, and that 2/3 of the voters think this was a very bad idea. Nevertheless, the regime people still thought it was worth the risk because the danger of Mr. Georgescu winning the presidency was just too damn high. But how high was that danger really? You see, the regime press said that Călin Georgescu would have likely won the second round of the presidential election, and that would have been very bad for the country. That's the official claim. Outside observers saw that and read it as Călin Georgescu being a right-wing extremist, mainly because most outside observers suffer from terminally online Americanism. Now, to be fair, some of Georgescu's supporters suffer from this too, but the thing is that while this guy is many things, he's simply not a far-right extremist, and the evidence of him being on the payroll of the Kremlin is still approximately zero. Outside observers on the right just assumed that the Russian allegation is false, but they also assumed he's a right-winger, while outside observers on the left assumed that the Russian allegation is true, but also assumed that he's an extremist, which goes to show the perils of applying your own stencils or biases upon contexts you don't understand. Anyway, outside observers' biases notwithstanding, Călin Georgescu is primarily an imposter who uses crackpot ideas. He just happens to use crackpot ideas that the current establishment, both here and in Brussels, doesn't like. But they did like him just a few short years ago when he was peddling their favorite crackpot ideas such as net zero, sustainable development, and other similarly extremist and equally crackpot ideas whose falling out of favor cannot come fast enough. Also, the claims about the alleged danger represented by this guy are intentionally exaggerated and intentionally dishonest. Let me break it down quickly. Again, for a very long history of this guy, just check my Romanian language channel. I won't translate that because it's tedious and includes a lot of references that would require huge blocks of text to explain in English, and I'm not publishing leftist memes on this channel. Anyway, so On the exaggeration front, you see, the president of Romania is not like the president of Argentina or the president of the United States. The president here is slightly more important than a standard parliamentary republic like Germany or Finland or Austria, but less important than in a presidential republic, namely that the president is not the head of the executive. So when the establishment says Georgescu would take the country out of the European Union, for instance, that's what they claimed. Now that is a straight up lie. Now don't get me wrong, I wish it were that simple to exit this dangerous anti-capitalist death cult that is the European Union, but it simply isn't that easy. It requires a constitutional amendment, which means a referendum, and 2/3 majority in the parliament, and the consent of the Constitutional Court. Even if by some miracle tomorrow 70% of Romanians want to get out of the EU, which they don't at this point, one presidential term may simply not be enough to pull it off. Same goes for other things. The establishment claimed that this guy wants to take the country out of NATO. Good luck with that. I mean, unlike the EU, NATO is in fact very popular here with 80% plus majority support that stayed consistent over the last 25 years. And again, to pull that off, you need a constitutional amendment as well. The president simply can't do this even if he really wants it. The smarter people in the establishment tried to work around this reality by claiming that he would ride the populist wave and trigger snap elections multiple times until he gets enough of his own people in the parliament. Well, there's just one problem. While in theory, snap parliamentary elections are possible, they never happened since the return of democracy. Why? Well, because the procedure to pull that off is intentionally designed to be very hard. There have been multiple instances in the last 35 years when 2/3 of the political class agreed that snap elections are a good idea. Last time this was the case in 2019, but also in 2011 and 2012 and several other times. Yet it still didn't happen because it requires the current MPs to agree. And I'm sure you're shocked to learn there is an active shortage of MPs agreeing to get themselves fired. Interesting side point about 2011 and 2012, in both of those political crises, Călin Georgescu was among the names floated around to become the next prime minister, a position from which even I would agree that this guy would be dangerous. So yeah, the exaggerations are mostly an exercise of the current ruling class not wanting to face its own recent past, namely that they all contributed to the success of Călin Georgescu. He's quite literally the result of their own conspiracies, an experiment that went wrong, at least from their perspective. But again, the voters are not at fault for this, and really neither is Russia. To the extent that there is a Russian involvement, it's more noticeable in the SOS party than around this guy. Heck, even the more establishment types, I mean, whenever they open their mouths, it's more, the more I'm suspecting that they are the Russian shills. I mean, really, think about it. If you worked for Russia, would you do things too differently from the way the National Liberal Party is doing them right now? Because I wouldn't change too much. Okay, maybe I'd amplify the Russian-schooled former culture minister. Oh wait, they do that already. Okay. I don't know, maybe lose some national treasuries that really tickle the electorate that is susceptible to Mr. Georgescu's message. Oh wait, they did that too. Yeah, so really at this point, it's the establishment that makes Russia look stronger than it actually is. Now, onto the dishonesty front. The hysteria about Mr. Georgescu's unexpected success is primarily about covering up the sins of the current establishment. Comfortable majorities of my fellow countrymen believe that the country is heading in the wrong direction, and they blame the Social Democrats and the National Liberals primarily for this. And you know what? They're not entirely wrong. These two parties have been in power since 1990 almost uninterruptedly. In fact, if you're looking for a cabinet that did not include either the National Liberals or the Social Democrats, you come up with a very short list, namely the two so-called technocratic experiments in 1999 and 2016. None of this should be surprising either. It is in fact very common in Europe for large parties to eventually take a nosedive and even disappear altogether. But the current ruling class is structurally incapable of understanding this. A lot of them truly do believe that the only reason someone won't vote for them is because they've been brainwashed by social media. Even though the signs of this have been there for over a decade. It just so happens that the position, fuck the regime, is now so big that it's impossible to ignore. I mean, while I do know people who voted for this guy, I don't know anyone who voted with this guy. Now, what do I mean by that? Most people who voted for this guy didn't do it because they knew him or even liked him. They did it because they wagered, correctly as it turns out, that he would piss off the establishmentarians the most. Politico.eu was noticing a few weeks ago that this guy's popularity after the annulment and the revelations about him ended up increasing his popularity. Well, duh! At this point, it's not about Mr. Georgescu, if it truly ever was. The extremist candidate, as the media dubbed him, is now an institution. At the moment of this recording, it is not known whether he'll be allowed to run again or not. But if he won't be allowed to run, then the next extremist candidate will gobble up all of the votes. Whether it will be the ECR guy or someone else, that remains to be seen throughout February and March. But the electorate, who simply despises the current crop of politicians, ain't going anywhere. And if anything, this whole clown show radicalized them even further and gathered new people in that crowd as well. Heck, I was chatting with a more distant relative last week. I haven't spoken with her in years, and the last time I spoke politics with her was more than 5 years ago. I didn't even bring up politics now because I really don't like bringing up my work interests in family conversations, but she did. Out of the blue, she was like, yeah, of course I voted for Georgescu. And I'm like, okay, but why? And her swift response was exactly the one I was expecting. Because fuck these people. Yeah, fuck Iohannis, fuck Ciolacu, fuck Barna, fuck Nicu Șordan, fuck all of them. Let's put a new face. And again, this is a working class woman in her late 50s who rarely voted. And there's millions like her. And to people like that, no policy argument will work. They won't be convinced. If anything, you telling them that this guy is crazy increases their support. Oh, he's crazy too? Great, that's exactly what you deserve over there in Bucharest. And that is a comment I've heard multiple times on the campaign trail. And slowly but surely, the Westoid leftists are also coming to the same conclusion. They won't support Călin Georgescu, but now they stopped giving a shit and are going scorched earth on the regime as well. Why? Because they correctly feel the wind of change, and they're hoping there is at least some room for them too in the new realignment. Now, of course, I'm hoping there isn't, but still, they're not wrong on their current assessment. And this view from the non-systemic Westoid left has become more pronounced as the ruling alliance just came out with their new candidate, Călin Antonescu. Now, foreign friends of the sofa may not know him, but may be more familiar with his wife, Adina Vălean, EU Transport Commissioner in the first von der Leyen Commission. She's the genius that came up with the EU plan to enforce social distancing in airplanes during the pandemic project. The plan lasted for a whole grand total of 20 seconds until the airliners could catch their breath from laughing and then not so politely telling her to go pound sand. But her husband, Călin Antonescu, used to be a big shot in Romanian politics over a decade ago. He was the leader of the National Liberals and was even acting president for a bit over a month during the second suspension of President Băsescu. Now, unfortunately for him, the electorate still preferred Băsescu, just like in 2009 when he came out third in the presidential election. In 2013, he came up with the idea of Klaus Iohannis, who would then become president in 2014, and worked hard to make him president, and then, after succeeding, he disappeared from public life for 10 years, until December 2024, which led even Westoid leftists to conclude that this is a Iohannis Antonescu rotation of the cadre, not significantly different in substance to the Putin-Medvedev rotation a decade ago. Imagine that. Even the intellectual left is calling these fuckers out on their BS. And again, for good reason. These people simply suck. Is Călin Georgescu a solution? No, of course not. But in election campaigns, perception is reality. And the perception is that he can't be worse than these people. And again, the wisdom of the crowds is correct. Georgescu can't be worse than these people because he is these people. Besides, the only time the presidency was hostile to NATO was when Călin Antonescu was president. So, once again, we have a case of projection. Now, none of this would matter that much if not for the fact that Brussels is very much in favor of all of it. Now, why is that? Well, for starters, the Bruxellean political class is dying. Not literally necessarily, although if you take a look at the green left parties in Brussels, it's mostly a boomer fest, but I mean they're dying politically. Europe has a very long inertia on these things. This has always been true. The 1848 revolutions, for instance, were decades in the making. Well, the same is true now. The backlash against the current ways of doing things are decades in the making. The problems were self-evident to people like me going back to at least 2004. If you scour the internet a little bit longer, and you may be able to find a text of mine from 2005 about the European Union. All you have to do is remove the date and the specific names of politicians from those texts, and you can pass it on as written last month. But that inertia isn't endless. At some point, enough is enough, and the Bruxellean political class fears, correctly I might add, that that time has come or will soon come. So they do what every dying political elite does, which is to try to hang on to power for as long as possible. Former Commissioner for Internal Market, now just a regular boomer loudmouth, Thierry Breton, straight up said it.
Dans le poids de la parole, attendons ce qui va se passer, et pour l'instant, gardons notre sang-froid et faisons appliquer nos lois en Europe lorsque celles-ci risquent d'être circonvenues et qu'elles peuvent, et si on ne les applique pas, conduire effectivement à des interférences. On l'a fait en Roumanie, il faudra évidemment le faire si c'est nécessaire en Allemagne.
Now, it also didn't help that this ended up being mistranslated. Even friendly media outlets, friendly to him, translated this as "we did it in Romania, we should do it in Germany too," in a spectacular own goal that got me laughing. But, laughter notwithstanding, Thierry Breton did say something true. That is the reason why Brussels is happy with this clown show. Because they hope that they can use the precedent to slow down other anti-establishmentarian candidates and parties in other countries of Europe. They know they can't stop it, but these kinds of tools can definitely slow down change for another term, and combined with the fact that the electorate now has the attention span of a goldfish, this could end up being quite a sweet deal for the politicians who are now in their late 50s or 60s. Because this is the part too many observers miss. This is all personal. And always has been. And it is in fact a very recent and already dying ideology that politicians ought to ignore their personal views for the sake of the institutions. Nobody really does that, and nobody ever did. But they all successfully pretended so for a few decades. But now every schmuck has the tools to prove that the emperor has always been naked. So this is all self-interested. Wouldn't it be nice to have a tool to at least slow down those goddamn plebs who keep on voting for anyone but not us? That's really all there is to it. All the talk about the rule of law, the dangers of extremism, all of that is smokescreen for the real motivation, which is personal wealth. Please do remember that the European Parliament is by far the most corrupt institution in Europe. It's not even a question. The only question is whether number 2 is the European Commission or the Italian Parliament. The jury is still out on that, but my bet is on the European Commission. So these are the worst people in existence in Europe. So of course they like the abuse of power if it favors their personal and group interests. But of course, when you put it in these words, it makes people uneasy, because for starters, it lays bare the fact that the sofa was right. You are all living in Eastern Europe. You just don't know it yet. Anyway, long story short, most of what you're being told in English about the clown show in Romania is either misleading or straight up a lie. And that includes most of the so-called alternative media as well. I mean, I've seen questions like these, like, oh, how come this guy can win and not be inaugurated? And I'm like, well, because he didn't win. The second round was not held. The president is elected via a runoff and not through a first-past-the-post system. All these little mistakes, and I'm sure some of them are intentional, add up to creating a false image. But again, the biggest hurdle is not Russian or Chinese or American disinformation. The biggest hurdle is the stupidity of the public, because nobody even asks questions anymore, let alone attempt to answer them. Whatever. I suppose that's also another story for another time. One more thing that I probably should mention. Remember the comparison with Medvedev that I made just a few minutes ago? Well, that one also lands very well here in Romania, even though it may sound odd in the western half of the continent. Why? Because, again, perception is reality. And the perception is that the current regime is deeply captured by the intelligence services. And while the reality is a lot more nuanced than that, the perception exists because of several facts. Like the fact that all of the European Union spends about 4 billion euros a year on intelligence services. More than a quarter of all of that, 1.1 billion euros annually, is spent by Romania. And that's just the expenditure on civilian domestic intelligence. The figure does not include military intelligence, special telecommunications, and a plethora of other things that are also under the umbrella of intelligence services. This country has more intelligence operatives than almost all countries of Europe, and a per capita basis, only Bulgaria and Lithuania has more. Though here I would argue Austria also has more if we include the FSB partners, but that's also a discussion for another day. But for the purposes of this talk, the existence of such a huge intelligence apparatus is correctly regarded as suspect in and of itself, especially after we all got to read their intelligence reports on the election, which again are below 6th grade compositions and generally have the level of professionalism of a potato. So this reality does lead to a perception that there is a version of the Siloviki at place here. And as a result, comparisons with Medvedev land very well with both the left and the right. At least with the civilians, I mean. Yeah, that's another joke that needs explaining. The running joke in the public space is that there are so many regime shills that are paid by the intelligence services that even the regime itself lost track of them. It all started from a huge gaffe of former NATO Deputy Secretary Mircea Joană back in 2007, who, when asked whether there are too many intelligence operatives, his shocking response was, well, first of all, we don't know how many of us are there.
Nu știm cât suntem în primul rând. Nu știm cât suntem în primul rând.
So yeah, in this climate, of course nobody trusts the authorities anymore, and for good reason. Most of these people are inherently untrustworthy. The pandemic project also helped a lot with getting more people to notice this. None of these people can be trusted. Now, is that situation dangerous? Yeah, sure, of course it is. But the danger is not in people pointing out that the current way of doing things is wrong and the current crop of leadership utterly sucks in every single regard and it is effectively unsalvageable. The danger is in attempting to perpetuate the current state of affairs and refusing to change things. And the more the regime attempts to resist change, the worse things will get. And this is true not just in Romania, it's true in Germany as well, and in Austria, and in Serbia, and in Norway, and in France, and so many other places. If you refuse to debate and compromise, then the change will still come, but worse. It's the way things go. Always have been. It's an idea whose time has come. The bad news is that some really inappropriate figures end up representing those ideas whose time has come, like it is the case with Mr. Georgescu or Le Pen in France. But the even worse news is that those ideas aren't going away. So the regime really has a choice. Get talking with the next extremist candidate, or in 5 years you'll start regretting Mr. Georgescu or Le Pen. What cannot go on will not go on, and the current way of doing things, both in Romania and in most of the European Union, cannot go on. Now, will something better come out of it? No, I don't think so. And I'll be glad to be proven wrong about this, but it's unlikely for the simple reason that I actually know most of these people personally. But hey, let's hope I'm wrong. Still, when even the World Economic Forum admits it lost, something's gotta give. No, seriously, here's from the World Economic Forum at Davos this year.
Trump has done something no person in the world has ever done before. A dead man, a dead politician, has risen. Somebody who, if we were 4 years ago at Davos, he's buried, dead politically, known to me. He's now returned. This is the greatest comeback in political history of a politician. And then, therefore, he thinks he can do anything. There's a supreme confidence now about that. And lo and behold, I mean, this is a phenomenon that we shouldn't try to understand only in the terms that we're traditionally accepting. We should say something strange, new, and amazing is happening here, and we should study it. Yeah.
Walter.
I would agree with that, both Ian and Graham on that. And I think I'd add that we need to also factor in not only who's won, which is Trump, but who's lost, which is to say us. That is to say the sort of general kind of intellectual, professional, managerial people who sort of thought that the world was basically, history was over and we were administering and trying to manage things according to rules that were all clear and known, and that history was kind of cumulative, and that, you know, tomorrow, even though we see this tech revolution happening around us, tomorrow's still going to be basically like today with incremental shifts. That's not how things work, and especially not how things work at this kind of moment. And I guess I would throw into that the epitome of the us who is losing here is Europe. The European Union and by and large its member states have misread the direction where events were going. Sorry, my mic. I'm usually pretty loud. I hope you can hear me. And that the European Union is the causes that it is interested in, climate, human rights, some others, as well as the methods of diplomacy that it prefers, are simply being gradually kind of marginalized as something new, not necessarily something better, but something new moves into the center.
So yeah, that's the shortest version of the current clown show in Romanian politics that I can muster. I mean, the shortest that doesn't rely on snippets and it's not intentional propaganda, that is. If you want propaganda, then head over to our TikTok channel. No, seriously, we do have a TikTok channel. But even better, please do consider becoming a member, and in doing so, freeing up more of my time to do things like these. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.